Imagine traveling back in time to witness the darkest and most intense moments of World War II like never before. Forget the cold pages of history books. This is a visual recreation that exposes the fear, destruction, and decisions that shaped the fate of the world. From devastating battles to hidden conspiracies, every scene has been animated to reveal the true brutality of the global conflict. But there are secrets few dare to tell. And what you're about to see may change your perspective on the war forever. Are you ready to experience World War II in a way you never imagined? It's 1902. A young Italian man named Benito Mussolini flees to Switzerland to avoid military service. While there, he immerses himself in socialism, working with trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, and passionately advocating for the violent overthrow of European monarchies. Unsurprisingly, this gets him into trouble. The Swiss police arrest him and deport him back to Italy. Once released, he returns to Switzerland, only to get arrested again. After another deportation, he finally gives in and completes his military service, the very thing he had tried so hard to avoid. For a brief moment, he even works as an elementary school teacher. But soon enough, he finds his way back to his true passion, political activism. Mussolini's powerful speeches and sharp journalistic skills quickly make him a rising star among Italian socialists. He is fiercely anti-war, so when Italy colonizes Libya in 1910, he protests and, predictably, gets arrested. Then comes World War I. Once again, he rallies against Italy's involvement. But then, something shifts. He starts to think, what if this war could create the perfect conditions for a socialist revolution? Suddenly, he does a complete 180. Now, he's pro-war. His fellow socialists, however, don't take kindly to this betrayal, and they expel him from the party. At this point, Mussolini has a revelation. Maybe socialism isn't the answer after all. Maybe Italy doesn't need a revolution based on class struggle, but rather a movement built on national unity. He envisions a powerful empire stretching across the Mediterranean, reuniting all Italian peoples, just like the glory days of ancient Rome. And so, he creates a new ideology: fascism. Well, that's all great, Mr. Mussolini. But what kind of haircut are we going with today? Italy had emerged victorious in World War I, and its people expected great rewards. But in the end, Italy received little, and the country felt betrayed. Economic turmoil and weak governments left the population disillusioned and desperate. So, when Mussolini came along, promising to restore Italy to greatness, his fascist movement quickly gained momentum. In 1922, Mussolini marched up to the King of Italy and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Make me Prime Minister, or I'll make myself Prime Minister. The king scoffed. You and what army? Mussolini simply pointed. This army. The king took one look and said, fair enough. And just like that, Mussolini seized power. From there, he wasted no time dismantling democracy and establishing a dictatorship with himself at the center. Europe now had its first fascist dictator. Next stop, Germany. Germany had been on the losing side of World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles crushed them. They lost land, were forced to demilitarize the Rhineland, and had to reduce their army to a mere 100,000 men. No air force, no real power. And to make matters worse, they were burdened with an astronomical war debt that they simply couldn't afford to pay. To the Germans, it felt like a national humiliation. If that wasn't bad enough, imagine a new law allowing any Englishman to stroll into Berlin, pick out a random German, and spank them senseless. Okay, I made that part up. But honestly, that's how the Treaty of Versailles felt to the German people. On top of all that, economic disaster and weak leadership left Germany desperate for a savior. And then, along came a small, furious man with a ridiculous mustache, promising to restore Germany's former glory. The people listened, and they liked what they heard. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier from World War I, was fiercely patriotic and absolutely livid over Germany's humiliation. He helped found a radical new political movement, and in 1923, he attempted a coup in Munich. It failed. He got arrested. But his influence only grew. By 1933, his time had come. The German president appointed him chancellor. With his rise to power, Hitler was convinced that he was Germany's destined savior. He immediately went full megalomaniac, consolidating control, silencing opposition, and turning Germany into a full-fledged dictatorship with himself at its core. Europe now had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini shared many of the same ideologies, but, more importantly, they had the same enemies. It wasn't long before they started getting along. Anyone else want to join the party? Franco? No, I'm good. Anyone? I do. Who's that? It's Japan. And Japan had just taken over northern China. Let's rewind. For over 200 years, Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world. That is, until the Americans showed up and basically said, "You're going to trade with us, and you're going to like it." Japan had no choice. Soon after, the Western powers imposed a series of humiliating treaties, crippling Japan's economy. Worse still, Japan had no natural resources of its own. So, they made a decision. If we don't have resources, we'll go out and take them. They went to war with China, seizing territory and expanding their influence in Korea. But then the Western powers stepped in. Hey, cut that out! Japan, knowing it couldn't take on the entire West, begrudgingly backed down. But then, Japan noticed something. Wait a minute. What are you guys doing? Oh, nothing. Just taking advantage of China's weakness and carving out our own spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And now you're taking all the rewards, but not letting me have anything? We know. That doesn't seem fair. We don't think so. Japan had had enough. Fine. See you later. Determined to prove itself, Japan turned its sights on Russia. They went to war. The world expected Japan to get crushed. Instead, Japan shocked everyone by winning. Now emboldened, Japan fully annexed Korea. But they didn't stop there. During World War I, Japan took Germany's colonies in Asia. Then, in what many believe was a staged event, an explosion destroyed a Japanese train in Manchuria. Japan used this as an excuse to launch a full-scale invasion, taking control of the region. Now, let's take a look at the world stage. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. All three believed they were racially superior. All three despised the Allied powers. And all three had one goal in mind: military expansion. So, they got to work. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to dismantle it, piece by piece. The first Luftwaffe squadrons were formed, conscription was introduced, and Hitler rapidly expanded and modernized his army. The Allies? They did nothing. Then he made his next move, marching German troops back into the demilitarized Rhineland. But Hitler wasn't stupid. He knew that if the Allies reacted, his army wasn't strong enough to hold its ground. So he gave a direct order. If they show up, retreat immediately. The Allies? Again, they did nothing. With his military position strengthened and his confidence soaring, Hitler was ready for the next step. He had an ambitious goal: He wanted to drastically increase the Aryan population. And for that, he needed Lebensraum, or in simple terms, he needed to take over the world. For now, though, a good chunk of Europe would do just fine. As Hitler set his sights on his neighbors, the Allies finally started to worry. Their response? A weak diplomatic strategy called appeasement, which played out like this. Hitler, I want that thing. Allies, you can't have that thing. Hitler, okay. Allies, fine, you can have that thing. But no more. Hitler, I want that thing too. Repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria. There was no resistance, no fighting, nothing. Boom! Austria was now part of Germany. Next, he turned his eyes toward the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, home to many ethnic Germans. Hitler demanded control of it. The Allies scrambled and held an emergency meeting with him in Munich. All right, Hitler, we're going to give you what you want. From across the border, Czechoslovakia blinked in disbelief. This is our territory. Shouldn't we be at this meeting? The Allies ignored them. Hitler, suspicious, asked, Wait, really? Yes, just like that. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Sure. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home triumphant, waving the signed paper in the air. Crisis averted. World peace is saved. They even built a statue in his honor, and every year on September 30th, they celebrated Chamberlain Day. And then, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia? Oh, you lied to me. Hitler shrugged. What did you expect? I'm Hitler. Meanwhile, Mussolini, not one to be left out, decided he wanted in on the action. He asked himself, is there an uncolonized country out there so underdeveloped that their people would have to fight against our tanks with literal bows, arrows, and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so, Italy invaded Ethiopia. But Mussolini wasn't done. Italy also wanted control over the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania as well. Then, over in Asia, Japan was on the move again. After an incident, which may or may not have been staged, gunfire broke out between Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge. Japan wasted no time. They launched another full-scale invasion. They tore through Beijing, then Shanghai, then advanced toward China's capital, Nanjing. What happened next? A horror unlike anything seen before. The Nanjing Massacre, one of the most brutal atrocities of the entire war. Back in Europe, Hitler and Mussolini made their partnership official, signing the Pact of Steel. Now, Hitler had his next target in sight, Poland. The thing that infuriated him most? The Polish Corridor, a strip of land splitting Germany in two. This time, the Allies had enough. They gave him an ultimatum. If you invade Poland, there will be war. But Hitler wasn't interested in fighting a war on two fronts. He needed to secure his eastern flank first. So, he did the unthinkable. He made a deal with Stalin. Hey, how about we both invade Poland and split it between us? And you definitely won't betray me later? Oh, totally. I definitely won't betray you. Sounds good. The world was stunned. And then, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler's troops stormed into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Polish army fought fiercely, but between Hitler's blitzkrieg from the west and Stalin's Red Army from the east, they never stood a chance. And then came a strange period known as the Phony War, where, despite officially being at war, nobody really did anything. The French launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but then just turned around and went home. For now, The world braced itself. The war had only just begun. Speaking of France, the French were still riding high on their victory in World War I. The problem? They hadn't really moved on from it. They still relied on horses. They delivered messages by motorbike instead of using radio. Orders from the commander-in-chief were often vague, and troops were rarely inspected. To defend against Germany, they built a massive line of fortifications along their border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the English Channel. And to top it off, they were so afraid of retaliation that they refused to launch artillery strikes on German positions. France didn't want to attack the enemy. And, at first, Britain wasn't much better. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain still clung to the naive hope that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the Royal Air Force, RAF, dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities. One British air marshal later said that these leaflets probably did nothing except provide free toilet paper to the Germans for the duration of the war. Meanwhile, Britain only sent 200,000 men to France. The French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid another World War I. Their strategy? Keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their attention north, toward Norway. The problem? Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway. The Allies politely asked Sweden, "Hey, could you maybe stop helping Germany?" Sweden refused. Then, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. So the Allies tried another approach. What if we land troops in Norway and move them through Sweden to help Finland? And while we're at it, maybe we just take control of all your iron fields? Sweden and Norway both said no. Frustrated, Britain mined Norwegian waters to force German transport ships into international waters. They also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. But Hitler was one step ahead. Realizing what the Allies were up to, he moved fast. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in a swift operation. The Allies scrambled to land troops at key Norwegian ports, but Germany had already secured airfields, giving them air superiority, and that was enough to decide the battle. The Allies were forced to retreat. This humiliating failure led to Chamberlain's resignation. His replacement? Winston Churchill. And Churchill had a very different approach to dealing with the Germans. The attack on France. Hitler's grand strategy for World War II was similar to Germany's plan in World War I. Attack France. Defeat France. Knock out Britain in the process. Turn on the Soviet Union. Win the war. During the phony war, Hitler had used the lull in fighting to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to strike. The Allies had wanted to station troops in Belgium to prepare for an invasion, but Belgium refused. Then, in a move that surprised absolutely no one, Hitler invaded Belgium. The Allies charged in at full speed, expecting another World War I-style slugfest. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve: blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they flooded Western Europe with refugees, slowing down the Allied response. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes under-defended, believing the dense forests and rough terrain made it impassable. The Germans proved them wrong. They smashed through the Ardennes with 50 Wehrmacht divisions, breaking through enemy lines with lightning speed. In just days, the best of the French and British forces were trapped. The Germans tightened the noose, crushing France's elite armies and nearly wiping out the British forces as well. France was on the brink of disaster, but in a desperate last-minute escape, thousands of British and French troops were evacuated at Dunkirk. With British civilian ships braving the perilous journey to rescue their young men, the operation became a symbol of heroism and survival. Even so, with most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through France. Paris fell. And just like that, France was gone. What Germany couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had just done. The UK stands alone. Hitler assumed that, with France defeated, Britain would surrender too. But, quite annoyingly, it didn't. Now, Hitler needed to secure the Western Front. So, he turned to mind games. First, just before France collapsed, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Then, instead of occupying all of France, Hitler took only the coastal areas for defense, allowing the rest of the country to exist as a German puppet state. His message to Britain? Your old ally has switched sides. Hitler also hoped this puppet France would prevent the UK from attacking French naval bases or colonies in Africa, effectively giving Germany an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK had other plans. They sailed down to France's naval base in Algeria and wrecked a bunch of French ships, just to prove a point. The Battle of Britain begins now. Hitler had to force Britain into submission. Before German troops could land on British soil, he needed air and naval superiority over the English Channel. So, he sent wave after wave of German bombers. The outnumbered RAF fought bravely, working around the clock to hold back the Luftwaffe. At first, the Germans targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then, they focused on RAF air bases, crippling Britain's air defenses. It looked like Hitler's invasion of Britain was imminent. Hitler's fatal mistake. But then, Churchill ordered a tiny, insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It did almost no damage, but Hitler was furious. Enraged, he changed tactics, ordering the Luftwaffe to shift focus from RAF bases to civilian targets in London. Suddenly, the Blitz had begun. Children were sent to the countryside to escape the bombings. Frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily routine. But despite the terror, British morale never wavered. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually. These people had balls of steel. The turning point, Hitler's obsession with bombing London, turned out to be a huge mistake. With less pressure on RAF airfields, the British had time to recover. Finally, in a massive all-out attack on London, the RAF fought back harder than ever. They shot down German planes in droves, placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion plans were postponed indefinitely. But the bombing of British cities would continue for months to come.